Welcome to the Perspicacious Perspective. This episode is all about philosophy. So there's what's known as 5 traditional core branches of philosophy. That's metaphysics, the study of reality, existence, and the nature of being. Epistemology, the study of knowledge, belief, and justification. Logic, the study of valid reasoning and argument. Ethics, the study of what is right, wrong, good, or bad. And political philosophy, that's the study of justice, rights, government, and the state. There are other branches which includes aesthetics, which is the philosophy of art, beauty, and taste, philosophy of mind, which is the study of consciousness, thought, and mental states, philosophy of language, the study of meaning, reference, and linguistic structure, philosophy of science, the study of scientific methods, foundations, and implications, philosophy of religion, the study of religious belief, arguments for or against God, and the nature of faith, philosophy of law, philosophy of history, philosophy of education, philosophy of technology, philosophy of mathematics and applied ethics, which includes medical ethics, environmental ethics, and contemporarily includes artificial intelligence ethics. This episode, however, will focus on the 5 core branches of philosophy. That's metaphysics, epistemology, logic, ethics, and political philosophy. My objective will be to give you some key terms that you may have come across before and explain to you which branch of philosophy this way of thinking belongs to, who the first people were to formalize this philosophical way of thinking, what the fundamental beliefs are, and I'll try to give examples of instances that would typically be ascribed to such philosophy. I'll also give you some key terminology that belongs to the branch of aesthetics, so stay tuned if you're interested in the philosophy within that branch. Let's start with metaphysics. So remember, metaphysics is the study of reality, existence, and the nature of being. Dualism is the belief that reality consists of 2 fundamentally different kinds of substances, often the mind and the body. Dualism as a formalized philosophical concept is most famously associated with René Descartes, who articulated substance dualism, the idea that mind and body are 2 distinct substances. Ancient Greeks, including Pythagoras, Plato, and Aristotle, all hinted at dualist ideas. Plato, especially, with his theory that the soul exists separately from the body and is immortal. Indian philosophies that predate the 6th century, before the Common Era, distinguish between consciousness and matter. So while Descartes is the first to frame dualism systematically in early modern Western philosophy, he is building on a long lineage of dualistic thinking. At its core, dualism is the belief that reality consists of 2 fundamentally different kinds of stuff, so to speak. Most often, this refers to mind-body dualism, the mind, or soul, being immaterial, thinking, and conscious, and the body, or matter, being physical, extended in space, and mechanistic. The key claim here is that mental phenomena cannot be fully explained in terms of physical processes. To give you an example of dualist thinking, imagine a neuroscientist mapping brain activity while you experience pain. A materialist or physicalist would think pain is just neurons firing, nothing more, whereas a dualist would think pain is experienced subjectively. There's a conscious, qualitative, what it's like aspect that can't be reduced to brain activity. A dualist might argue that the mind or soul can survive death because it is not dependent on the physical body. Monism is the belief that reality is ultimately one substance or kind of thing. The idea of monism, that everything is ultimately one, is very old, and its first appearances are scattered across different traditions. In Western philosophy, the pre-Socratic philosophers between the 6th and 5th century before Common Era were the earliest to propose monistic views. Thales claimed that everything is ultimately water. Anaximenes said air is the fundamental substance, and Parmenides argued that reality is one, unchanging and indivisible. These thinkers are considered proto-monists because they sought a single principle behind all reality. In Eastern philosophy, particularly in India, they argued that all reality is ultimately pure consciousness, and that multiplicity is an illusion. Taoism from China postulates that the Tao is the underlying unity of all things. So there's no single first person to come up with monism, but Parmenides and later Spinoza are often seen as key figures in explicitly framing monism philosophically in the West. At its core, monism is the belief that reality is ultimately one kind of thing. It can take a variety of forms, including material monism, which means that everything is ultimately physical, for example, matter and energy. Idealist monism, which means everything is ultimately mental or spiritual, for example, mind or consciousness. And neutral monism, which means both mind and matter are expressions of some more fundamental neutral substance. The key claim is that there are not two or more fundamentally different substances. All apparent diversity is ultimately perceived as one. Let's say someone asks, what is a human being? A dualist would say, a human is a union of mind and body, being two separate substances. A monist would say, a human is just one kind of thing, perhaps entirely physical or entirely mental. Spinoza argued that God and nature are the same reality. For him, there is only one substance, and everything we perceive is a mode of that substance. Determinism is the view that every event is caused by prior conditions, leaving no room for chance or free will. Believing a criminal's actions were fully determined by genetics and upbringing would be an example of something that a determinist would believe. Determinism as a philosophical concept, the idea that every event has a cause and happens out of necessity, can be traced back to ancient philosophy. Leucippus and Democritus were among the first to propose a deterministic, mechanistic universe through atomism in the 5th century before Common Era, claiming that everything, including thought, is a result of atoms moving according to natural laws. Leucippus famously said, "Nothing occurs at random, but everything happens out of reason and by necessity." Stoics in the 3rd century before Common Era developed a sophisticated view of determinism, arguing that the cosmos is governed by logos, rational order. Determinism was later refined by philosophers like Thomas Hobbes, Baruch Spinoza, and Pierre-Simon Laplace, who introduced the thought experiment of Laplace's demon, a hypothetical intellect that, knowing all the facts about the universe at one time, could predict the future with certainty. So Leucippus is often credited as the first determinist, at least in Western thought. At its core, determinism is the view that every event, including human decisions and actions, is the inevitable result of prior causes and the laws of nature. This means that nothing happens by pure chance. If you knew every fact about the present state of the universe, you could, in theory, predict the entire future. Some determinists go further and argue that free will is an illusion, called hard determinism, while others try to reconcile free will with determinism, which they call compatibilism. Suppose a person commits a crime. The determinist view would be that the crime was the inevitable result of genetic predispositions, brain chemistry, upbringing, environment, and preceding events. Given the exact same prior conditions, the person could not have acted differently. A determinist might argue that if we knew the exact position and velocity of every particle in the universe right now, we could predict precisely what will happen a million years from now. Free will is the capacity to make choices that are not wholly determined by prior causes, that humans have the capacity to choose their actions independently. Aristotle is often considered the first philosopher to systematically discuss something like free will. He argued that humans are responsible agents because they act with deliberation and choice. Epicurus introduced the idea of a swerve in the motion of atoms to allow for human freedom in an otherwise deterministic universe. In Christian philosophy, St. Augustine was one of the first to explicitly use the term liberum arbitrium, which means free choice of the will. He argued that free will is necessary for moral responsibility, otherwise reward and punishment would be unjust. So while Aristotle is often credited with first analysing free will philosophically, Augustine was the first to explicitly coin and rigorously define the term in a theological, philosophical sense. At its core, belief in free will is the claim that human beings have the genuine capacity to choose between different possible actions and are therefore morally responsible for what they do. This usually means that not all events are predetermined. Even if the past and the laws of nature are fixed, you still have the power to do otherwise. Moral praise and blame are meaningful because actions are freely chosen. Different philosophers hold different views. Some think free will is totally incompatible with determinism, what they call libertarian free will, while others think it can coexist with determinism, which is what is referred to as compatibilism. Imagine someone is deciding whether to donate money to charity. A believer in free will might say, I am free to choose whether to give or not. I could have done otherwise, and that choice is up to me. They hold themselves responsible for the decision, whether it was generous or selfish. A believer in free will might argue that criminals deserve punishment because they choose to commit crimes and could have chosen differently. Ontology is the branch of metaphysics that studies being, existence, and what kinds of things exist. Parmenides is considered the father of metaphysics, who argued that being is and non-being is not. Plato explored the distinction between eternal forms, or true being, and their appearances. Aristotle called metaphysics the science of being qua being, arguably the first systematic ontologist. So Aristotle is usually credited as the first philosopher to systematically study ontology, though the explicit term came much later. Ontologists are concerned with the nature of existence and categorizing what exists. In other words, they ask, what does it mean to exist? What kind of things are real, such as physical objects, numbers, properties, universals, or even other possible worlds? And they ask, what is the difference between existence and non-existence? An ontologist's fundamental belief is that there is a structure to reality, and we can describe and analyze what exists and how those entities relate to one another. Let's say someone asked whether numbers existed. An ontologist would investigate whether numbers are abstract objects existing independently of the mind, mental constructs existing only in thought, or merely linguistic tools, the names we give to patterns. Asking whether fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes exist, ontology tries to clarify what kind of being, if any, they have. Let's move on to epistemology, the study of knowledge, belief, and justification. Empiricism is the theory that knowledge comes primarily from sensory experience, for example, learning about gravity by observing falling objects. Aristotle emphasized that knowledge begins with sensory perception. Nothing is in the intellect that was not first in the senses. Epicurus argued that sensations are the foundation of all knowledge. Ancient Indian school and Buddhist philosophy also stressed perception as a primary source of knowledge. The term empiricism and its systematic defense as a philosophical doctrine was first articulated during the 17th and 18th centuries by Francis Bacon, who advocated for induction and observation as the basis of science, John Locke, who is considered the father of modern empiricism, who argued that the mind is a blank slate and all knowledge derives from experience, and it was later developed by George Berkeley and David Hume. So Aristotle laid the groundwork, but Locke is usually credited with formalizing empiricism as a distinct modern philosophical school. At its core, empiricism holds that all, or at least most, knowledge comes from sensory experience through seeing, hearing, touching, tasting, and smelling, and not from innate ideas or pure reason alone. This means that the mind starts as a blank slate. Observation and experiment are the path to knowledge, and reason is important, but it works with data that comes from experience. Imagine someone asks, how do we know that gravity exists? An empiricist would answer, because we observe its effects, objects fall, planets orbit, experiments confirm measurable force. Our belief in gravity comes from repeated experience, not from reasoning alone or from innate knowledge. When learning about fire, an empiricist would say, you know fire is hot because you've touched it or observed its effects, not because you reasoned it out a priori. Rationalism is the view that reason and innate ideas are the primary sources of knowledge. Descartes' claim, I think, therefore I am, is the most infamous perspective that stems from rationalism. Plato argued that true knowledge comes from reasoning about eternal forms, not from the changing sensory world. His famous allegory of the cave shows that the senses can deceive us, only rational insight reveals truth. Pythagoreans believed mathematics reveals the fundamental structure of reality, discovered through intellect, not observation. Rationalism as a formal philosophical movement took shape in the 17th century. René Descartes' I think, therefore I am, claimed we can gain certain knowledge through reason alone. Spinoza used the geometric method to deduce truths about God, nature, and ethics from self-evident axioms. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz believed in innate ideas and that reality can be understood through logical principles. So Plato first explored rationalism conceptually, but Descartes is considered the founder of modern rationalism. Rationalism holds that reason, not experience, is the ultimate source of knowledge. Certain truths are innate, self-evident, or discoverable by pure thought. This usually includes belief in innate ideas, for example concepts of God, infinity, and mathematics, confidence in a priori knowledge, truths knowable before experience like 2 + 2 = 4, and skepticism about relying solely on the senses, since they can be deceptive. Imagine someone asks, how do we know that 2 + 2 = 4? A rationalist answer would be, because it is a necessary truth discoverable by reason. We don't need to count pebbles to know it's true. A rationalist might say that we can recognize certain moral truths, like murder is wrong, through rational intuition, even without experience or cultural teaching. Skepticism is a philosophical position of doubting or suspending judgment about knowledge claims. Questioning whether we can ever be certain the external world exists is a skeptical thought process. Xenophanes criticized anthropomorphic conceptions of the gods and argued that humans can never have certain knowledge about divine matters. Socrates famously said, "I know that I know nothing," practicing systematic questioning to expose ignorance. Pyrrho of Elis is widely considered the founder of philosophical skepticism. He taught that because certain knowledge is impossible, we should suspend judgment and thereby achieve tranquility. So Pyrrho is usually credited as the first philosopher to explicitly formulate skepticism as a school of thought. Philosophical skepticism is the belief that we should doubt or suspend judgment about knowledge claims, either because certain knowledge is impossible or because withholding judgment leads to a better state of mind. The key claims skeptics often make is that our senses can deceive us, reasoning can be flawed, there are equally strong arguments for opposing views, so therefore dogmatic certainty should be avoided. Imagine someone claims the external world definitely exists exactly as we perceive it. A skeptic's response would be, how do you know? Could you be dreaming? Could your senses be deceiving you? Could we be living in a simulation? The skeptic suspends judgment rather than affirming or denying the claim. A skeptic might not deny climate change but would insist on carefully examining the evidence before accepting conclusions, constantly open to revising beliefs based on new data. A priori refers to knowledge that is independent of experience. For example, all bachelors are unmarried. The term a priori is Latin for from the earlier, and it was first explicitly used in philosophy by scholastic philosophers in the Middle Ages, such as Thomas Aquinas, who distinguished arguments from cause, a priori, versus from effect, a posteriori. Aristotle distinguished between knowledge of first principles, understood through reason, and knowledge from experience. Plato argued that knowledge of the eternal forms is innate and accessed through reason, not experience, a very a priori idea. The modern rigorous use of a priori was given by Immanuel Kant, who made it central to his Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. He distinguished between a priori knowledge being independent of experience, for example, mathematics and logic, and a posteriori knowledge being dependent on sensory experience. So while medieval scholastics coined the term, Kant gave a priori its most influential philosophical meaning. A priori thought holds that some knowledge can be known independently of sensory experience, purely through reason. The key features of a priori knowledge are that it is necessary, true in all possible worlds, it is universal, not based on individual experience, and it is often discoverable through deductive reasoning. In mathematics, 2 + 2 = 4. We don't need to count physical objects to know this, it's true by definition and can be known through reason alone. If all humans are mortal and Socrates is human, then Socrates is mortal. This is true regardless of empirical experience. It follows from the logical structure of the statement. A posteriori refers to knowledge derived from experience. For example, the knowledge that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. The term a posteriori is Latin for from the later, meaning from what comes after, and like a priori, it was first explicitly used by medieval scholastic philosophers from the 13th century onwards. Thomas Aquinas and other scholastics used a posteriori to refer to reasoning from effects to causes, for example, inferring God's existence from the existence of the world. The cosmological argument is called an a posteriori argument. The concept that some knowledge comes from experience goes back to Aristotle, who emphasized induction and empirical observation as the starting point of science. Empiricists such as Locke, Berkeley, and Hume later made a posteriori knowledge central to their epistemology. So the term was coined in the Middle Ages, but the idea that knowledge comes from experience was defended much earlier and became central to modern empiricism in the 17th and 18th centuries. A posteriori thought holds that knowledge is dependent on or derived from sensory experience. The key features of a posteriori knowledge include that it is empirical, meaning it comes from observation, experimentation, and perception. It is contingent, meaning it could be otherwise, for example, physical laws might have been different, and that it is often established through induction, which is reasoning from specific observations to general conclusions. Such as the example before, that water boils at 100 degrees Celsius at sea level. We know this because we have observed and measured it, not because it is logically necessary. Another example could be how we know that Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon in year 49 before Common Era. This is known by examining historical evidence, not through pure reasoning. Let's move on to logic. Logic is the study of valid reasoning and argument when it comes to philosophy. Deductive reasoning is reasoning from general premises to a logically certain conclusion. The first philosopher to formally acknowledge and systematize deductive reasoning was Aristotle. In his works, he explained how conclusions necessarily follow from premises. For example, all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. This is a deductive argument. If the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. While earlier thinkers used deduction informally in mathematics, Aristotle was the first to systematically study, formalize, and teach it as a philosophical method. Deductive reasoning is based on the principle that if the premises are true and the reasoning is valid, then the conclusion must necessarily be true. In other words, deduction moves from general principles to specific conclusions. It is truth preserving. Let me give you another example and break it down. Premise 1. All mammals are warm-blooded. Premise 2. All dogs are mammals, and the conclusion would be, therefore, all dogs are warm-blooded. If both premises are true, the conclusion cannot be false. Inductive reasoning is reasoning from specific observations to general principles, probabilistic, not certain. For example, the sun has risen every day so far, therefore it will rise tomorrow. The first philosopher to formally discuss inductive reasoning was Aristotle, the same thinker who formalized deduction. While deduction goes from the general to the specific, induction infers general principles from repeated observations. An example Aristotle might use: you see many individual swans, all of which are white. You infer that all swans are white. Induction became a cornerstone of scientific method much later, with Francis Bacon emphasizing it as the foundation of empirical science, collecting observations and then generalizing from them. Inductive reasoning is based on the principle that we can infer general rules, laws, or predictions from repeated particular observations, even though the conclusion is not guaranteed. Induction moves from specific cases to general principles. Its conclusions are probabilistic, not certain. It underlies most of science by forming hypotheses and theories from data. Let me give you another example and break it down again. Observation 1. The sun rose yesterday. Observation 2. The sun rose today. Observation 3. The sun rose every day you can remember. Conclusion. The sun will rise tomorrow. This conclusion is very likely, but not logically certain. It could, in principle, be false. A fallacy is a flaw in reasoning that weakens an argument. For example, the ad hominem fallacy is when you dismiss an argument because of who makes it, not its content. I did another episode on logical fallacies, so if you're interested in the range of logical fallacies that can be committed when it comes to sheer logic, be sure to check it out. The first philosopher to systematically study and classify fallacies was Aristotle. In his work, Sophistical Refutations, Aristotle analysed 13 types of fallacies, dividing them into fallacies in language, for example, ambiguity or equivocation, and fallacies not in language, for example, begging the question or false cause. He wanted to help people distinguish valid reasoning from flawed reasoning, especially in debates with sophists, who often use tricks to appear correct. Because of this, Aristotle is widely regarded as the father of the study of fallacies. A fallacy is an error in reasoning that makes an argument logically invalid or misleading, even if it seems persuasive. Fallacies can be formal, either structural or logical errors, or informal, errors in reasoning, relevance, or language. Recognizing fallacies is essential for critical thinking, to avoid being misled by bad arguments. Another example is the post hoc fallacy. Every time I wear my lucky socks, my team wins. Therefore, my socks make them win. This confuses correlation with causation, a classic causal fallacy. Validity is when a deductive argument is valid if the conclusion logically follows from the premises. For example, if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. The first philosopher to formally discuss and systematize validity was, you guessed it, Aristotle. Aristotle developed formal logic and introduced the idea that a good argument is one where the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. Aristotle developed formal logic and introduced the idea that a good argument is one where the conclusion necessarily follows from the premises. While Aristotle didn't use the exact modern word validity, his theory of syllogisms, logical reasoning where the conclusion is gotten from two linked premises, is the earliest systematic account of what we now call valid arguments. Later philosophers and logicians formalized and extended the concept into what we use today in modern logic. In philosophy and logic, validity refers to this. An argument is valid if and only if its conclusion follows logically from its premises. Meaning, it is impossible for the premises to be true and the conclusion false at the same time. Validity is about structure, not truth. A valid argument can still have false premises, but if the premises were true, the conclusion would have to be true. For example, 1. All mammals are warm-blooded. 2. All whales are mammals. 3. Therefore, all whales are warm-blooded. If 1 and 2 are true, 3 must be true, so the argument is valid. Soundness is a valid argument with true premises. For example, all humans are mortal, Socrates is human, therefore Socrates is mortal. True plus valid equals sound. Aristotle is also deemed responsible for the philosophical concept of soundness. Aristotle distinguished between arguments that are merely valid or structurally correct and those that are both valid and have true premises. He didn't use the modern word sound, but he clearly treated such arguments as the highest standard of reasoning. In philosophy and logic, an argument is sound if and only if 1. It is valid, and 2. All of its premises are true. So soundness equals validity plus truth. This makes a sound argument the strongest kind of argument possible. Its conclusion must be true. Using the same example we use for validity, 1. All mammals are warm-blooded. 2. All whales are mammals. 3. Therefore all whales are warm-blooded. The argument is valid. The conclusion follows logically and has true premises, so it's sound. Let's move on to another traditional core branch of philosophy, ethics. Ethics, also known as moral philosophy, is the study of what is right, wrong, good, or bad. Utilitarianism is a moral theory stating that the best action is the one that maximizes overall happiness or well-being. For example, a doctor saving 5 patients by using the organs of 1 healthy donor. While the idea that we should act for the greater good is very old, going back to Greek philosophy, utilitarianism as a formal philosophical theory was first articulated in the 18th century. Although in antiquity, Epicurus first argued that pleasure is the highest good, David Hume discussed moral approval based on usefulness and benefit to society in the 18th century. Jeremy Bentham is widely considered the first philosopher to formalize utilitarianism as a systematic ethical theory. In his work, Bentham argued that the right action is the one that maximizes happiness or pleasure and minimizes pain for the greatest number of people. He even proposed a way of measuring pleasure and pain to guide moral decisions. John Stuart Mill later refined Bentham's theory, emphasizing quality, not just quantity, of pleasures. At its core, utilitarianism is a form of consequentialism, meaning that the moral worth of an action is determined by its consequences, specifically how much happiness or well-being it produces. It follows the greatest happiness principle, choosing the action that maximizes overall happiness for the greatest number. It believes everyone's happiness counts equally and that consequences matter most. Intentions are less important than results. Imagine a doctor with 5 patients who each need a different organ to survive and one healthy person with compatible organs. The utilitarian response would be that the doctor might argue that sacrificing one person to save 5 maximizes overall happiness, even if it feels morally troubling. A less extreme example might be governments funding public health programs because they benefit the largest number of people. Another everyday example would be speed limits. A utilitarian might support them because they reduce accidents and save lives, thus producing the most overall well-being. Consequentialism is the ethical view that the morality of an action depends only on its outcomes or consequences. For example, donating money to charity is good because it reduces suffering regardless of motive. The term consequentialism is relatively modern. It was first coined by G.E.M. Anscombe in 1958 as a way to group together ethical theories that judge actions solely by their outcomes. But the concept, the idea that morality depends on consequences, goes back much further. Mozi, who was around during the 4th century before Common Era in China, advocated for impartial care and policies that benefit the most people, which is considered very consequentialist. Epicurus, who was around in the following century, held that pleasure and pain are the basis of good and evil, and Aristotle, while not a consequentialist himself, recognized that outcomes matter in ethics. Jeremy Bentham is considered the first person to fully develop the consequentialist theory. John Stuart Mill refined and popularized it, so Anscombe named it, but Bentham and Mill are the ones who gave it its classic form as a philosophical theory. Consequentialism is based on the principle that the moral rightness or wrongness of an action depends entirely on its consequences. An action is morally good if it leads to the best possible results. Everyone's outcomes count equally. There's no special moral privilege. It often involves comparing different possible actions and choosing the one with the best overall result. Imagine a scenario where lying will save someone's life. The consequentialist view would deem the lie to be morally right if it leads to the best outcome. They view that saving the life outweighs the harm of lying. Deontology is the ethical theory that actions are right or wrong based on rules and duties, not consequences. For example, telling the truth even when lying could save someone from harm. The term deontology comes from the Greek words deon, meaning duty, and logos, meaning study or science. The term was first introduced by Jeremy Bentham in the early 19th century, but he used it simply to mean the science of duty. The modern concept of deontological ethics, duty-based morality, was fully developed by Immanuel Kant in the 18th century. Kant argued that morality is grounded in rational duty, not consequences. His most famous formulation is the categorical imperative, which commands actions that can be universalized, meaning they can be followed by everyone without contradiction. So Bentham coined the word, but Kant built the most influential and systematic version of deontological ethics. Deontology is based on the principle that actions are morally right or wrong based on whether they follow moral duties, rules, or principles, not on the consequences they produce. It follows duty and obligation. Certain actions must or must not be done, no matter the outcome. It follows moral absolutes. Some things are intrinsically wrong, for example murder or lying, regardless of benefit, and universality. If an action cannot be willed as a universal law for everyone, it is immoral. Let's imagine a scenario where lying would save someone's life. The deontologist's view is that lying is always morally wrong, even if the consequences seem good, because telling the truth is a duty. Kant famously argued that one must tell the truth even to a murderer asking where his victim is hiding because lying would violate the moral law. Virtue ethics is when morality is about developing good character traits or virtues rather than following rules or calculating consequences. For example, being honest not because of duty or utility, but because honesty is part of a virtuous life. Virtue ethics as a formal philosophical approach originates in ancient Greece. Socrates asked questions like what is justice and what is courage, focusing on moral character rather than just rules or consequences. Plato emphasized the importance of cultivating virtues such as wisdom, courage, temperance, and justice for living a good life. Aristotle, considered the founder of systematic virtue ethics, taught that the highest human good is eudaimonia, which is a contented state of being happy, healthy, and prosperous. He believed we achieve eudaimonia by cultivating virtues, stable character traits like courage, honesty, generosity, and finding the golden mean between extremes. For example, courage being the mean between cowardice and recklessness. So while Socrates and Plato laid the groundwork, Aristotle is usually credited as the first to fully formalize virtue ethics as a coherent ethical system. Virtue ethics holds that morality is about becoming a good person, cultivating virtuous character traits rather than just following rules or maximizing good outcomes. It focuses on character. What kind of person should I be? Habituation, that virtues are developed through practice by repeatedly acting well until it becomes part of your character, and practical wisdom, that moral decision making requires wisdom to choose the right action in the right circumstances. Let's imagine a situation where you would find a lost wallet full of cash. A virtue ethics response would be to return it because an honest person would do so, and honesty is a virtue. The focus is not just on consequences, as a consequentialist would do, or on following a strict rule, as a deontologist would, but on acting in a way that expresses and develops good character. Another example would be a firefighter courageously running into a burning building to save someone, not recklessly, but with a measured sense of duty or virtue. Egoism is the ethical view that actions are morally right if they promote one's own best interests. For example, choosing a career path based on personal happiness rather than societal expectations. The concept of egoism, that individuals should act in their own self-interest, has very old roots, though the term is modern. Socrates sometimes hinted at the idea that doing good benefits the self. Epicurus explicitly argued that pleasure is the highest good, and individuals should seek their own well-being, though he advocated moderation to avoid long-term pain. Thomas Hobbes is widely regarded as the first to explicitly articulate egoism as a moral theory. He argued that humans are naturally self-interested and that society and morality are constructed. He argued that humans are naturally self-interested and that society and morality are constructed to keep that self-interest from leading to chaos. So Hobbes is usually credited as the first to formally acknowledge egoism as a philosophical concept, though Epicurus was an early forerunner. Egoism in its ethical form is the belief that the right action is the one that best advances one's own self-interest. Psychological egoism claims that all human actions are ultimately motivated by self-interest, even apparently altruistic ones. Ethical egoism claims that people should act in their own self-interest because it is morally right. Imagine you see someone drowning. An egoist would think you should help them only if doing so benefits you. For example, it will make you feel good, prevent you from feeling guilty, or gain you social approval. If rescuing them would put your own life in serious danger and harm your self-interest, the egoist might say that you are not morally obligated to help. An egoist would choose a job that maximizes their personal happiness, income, or fulfillment, regardless of whether it benefits society. So the penultimate core branch of philosophy I'm going to dissect on this episode is political philosophy, the study of justice, rights, government, and the state, which by the way is sometimes treated as part of ethics. I've also done another episode on political philosophy where I explain the major political theories from far left to far right, so again, check that out if you want a deeper dive into understanding political philosophy better. Thomas Hobbes is generally considered the first philosopher to formally develop the social contract as a major philosophical concept. It's a theory that political authority is justified by an implicit agreement among individuals to form society. Hobbes' idea was that people surrender freedoms to a sovereign for security. Plato discussed a proto-version of it in 360 before Common Era, where Socrates argued he must obey Athenian law because he implicitly agreed to live under it. Cicero also wrote about the idea of laws and justice being grounded in a kind of natural agreement. However, Thomas Hobbes is usually credited as the first to systematically articulate the social contract in Leviathan, written in 1651. Hobbes argued that in the state of nature, a lawless condition, life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To escape this, individuals agree via a contract to give up some freedoms and obey a sovereign authority for the sake of order and protection. John Locke refines Hobbes' theory and emphasized that the social contract is meant to protect natural rights including life, liberty, and property, and that governments can be overthrown if they break this contract. Jean-Jacques Rousseau later developed the idea of the general will and collective sovereignty. The philosophy of social contracts holds that legitimate political authority derives from an implicit or explicit agreement among free individuals to form a society and abide by its rules. The core beliefs surround the state of nature, that humans have natural freedom but face insecurity and conflict, mutual agreement, that people consent to give up some freedoms in exchange for security, order, and cooperation, and legitimacy of government, that political power is only justified if it serves the people and respects the terms of the social contract. Imagine a modern democratic society. A social contract theorist would say that by living in society, you implicitly agree to follow its laws, like paying taxes, because you benefit from the protection and order it provides. A Locke-inspired social contract theorist might argue that if a government becomes tyrannical, i.e. breaking the contract, citizens have a moral right to revolt, for example, the American Revolution, which was justified this way. Liberalism is a political philosophy emphasizing individual freedom, rights, and equality before the law. For example, freedom of speech protections in democratic societies. John Locke is widely regarded as the father of liberalism. He argued that all individuals have natural rights, including life, liberty, and property. Government should exist by consent of the governed and must protect those rights. If a government violates them, the people have the right to rebel. Montesquieu advocated separation of powers to prevent tyranny. Adam Smith applied liberal principles to economics, advocating free markets in his book The Wealth of Nations, and John Stuart Mill expanded liberalism to include freedom of speech, individual autonomy, and harm principle. People are free unless they harm others. So while the term liberalism became common later, John Locke is generally credited as the first major philosopher to articulate liberalism as a systematic political philosophy. At its core, liberalism holds that the highest political priority is the protection and promotion of individual liberty. Liberals believe in natural rights and freedom. Every individual has rights that must be respected, for example, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the freedom to own property. They believe in the rule of law and limited government, that government power should be constrained and accountable. They believe in the consent of the governed, that political authority is legitimate only if it is based on consent, and they fundamentally believe in equality before the law, that everyone should have equal legal standing and opportunities. Imagine a government wanting to ban certain books because they are politically controversial. The liberal view is that the ban is wrong because individuals have the right to freedom of expression, even if their views are unpopular. A liberal might support free markets with some regulation to protect both economic freedom and fairness. So Marxism is a socio-political theory that history is driven by class struggle and that capitalism will eventually be replaced by communism. The principal tenet behind it is that workers unite to overthrow capitalist structures. If you didn't know, Marxism is named after Karl Marx, who, along with Friedrich Engels, developed the philosophy in the Communist Manifesto in 1848, a political pamphlet calling for workers of the world to unite and overthrow capitalist systems. Das Kapital, Volume 1, written in 1867, is Marx's detailed critique of capitalism, focusing on how it exploits workers through surplus value. So Karl Marx was the first person to articulate Marxism as a philosophical, economic, and revolutionary theory, with Engels as his key collaborator and popularizer. At its core, Marxism is a theory of history, society, and economics that argues all of human history is shaped by class struggle, and capitalism will eventually be replaced by socialism and then communism, a classless, stateless society. His key principles are that history progresses through economic stages, from feudalism to capitalism, from capitalism to socialism, and from socialism to communism. Society is divided into classes whose interests conflict, particularly the bourgeoisie and capitalists, versus the proletariat and workers. He believes that capitalism exploits workers by paying them less than the value they produce, and that the working class must overthrow the capitalist system to establish a society based on common ownership of the means of production. Let's imagine a modern workplace where profits go almost entirely to shareholders while workers receive minimal wages. For a Marxist, this is an example of capitalist exploitation. A Marxist would argue for collective ownership of the factory or company so that workers share equally in the value they produce. A Marxist might interpret rising inequality as a symptom of capitalism approaching crisis, predicting eventual social upheaval or revolution. Anarchism is the belief that society should exist without hierarchical government or coercive authority. Anarchists believe in small self-governing communities without central rulers. The concept of anarchism, the rejection of unjust hierarchies and coercive authority, predates the term itself. Some ideas of stateless or authority-free societies can be found in ancient Chinese Taoist texts, which imagined minimal governance. The term anarchism, from Greek anarchos, meaning without rulers, and its systematic philosophical defense were first articulated by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon. In his famous 1840 work, What is Property?, Proudhon declared, property is theft. He argued that political authority and private property, in the sense of ownership that allows exploitation, are illegitimate. Proudhon called himself an anarchist, making him the first to explicitly claim the term as a political identity. Later influential anarchists in the 19th century advocated for revolutionary collectivism, anarcho-communism, and mutual aid, and anarchism as a philosophy of freedom, feminism, and social liberation. At its core, anarchism is a belief that all forms of unjust, coercive hierarchy, especially the state, should be abolished and society should be organized through voluntary, cooperative, and non-hierarchical means. Anarchists believe in the rejection of unjust authority from state, monarchy, or oppressive institutions. They believe people should freely associate and self-organize without coercion. They favor local decision-making, horizontal power structures, and federations of free communities. And they believe that cooperation and solidarity are natural and desirable ways for humans to thrive. Imagine a community facing food shortages. An anarchist would want the community to organize collectively, without government intervention, to share resources, produce food, and distribute it fairly, perhaps through mutual aid networks. They would reject top-down control or exploitation by a central authority or wealthy elite. Realism is the belief that international relations are driven by power and self-interest, not morality. A country invading another for strategic resources would be a prime example. Thucydides is often considered the first realist thinker in political philosophy. In History of the Peloponnesian War, he famously recorded the Melian Dialogue, where Athens justifies his actions with the principle that the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. This frames politics as a struggle for power, not moral ideals. Niccolò Machiavelli, however, is often called the father of modern political science. In his book The Prince, written in 1532, he argued that rulers must prioritize power and security, sometimes using deception or ruthlessness, because politics is not governed by morality in the same way private life is. So Thucydides is usually credited as the first to articulate realism as a political philosophical perspective, with Machiavelli and later thinkers giving it a systematic form. Let's imagine two rival countries competing for influence in a region. The realist view would be that the state should build alliances, strengthen its military, and balance against rivals, not because it's right, but because it ensures national survival. A realist might support negotiating with a morally corrupt regime if it serves the national interest, arguing that moral purity cannot outweigh strategic necessity. The last philosophical branch I'm going to talk about isn't considered one of the 5 traditional core branches, but is nonetheless considered an important branch of philosophy. I've included it just to ensure you're aware of how many concepts derive and can be attributed to philosophy. Aesthetics may be considered relatively subjective by many, but the reality is that art, beauty, and taste are part of the world we live in, and it does directly affect how we may decide to approach certain aspects of our lives and the world. Aestheticism is the philosophy that art should be valued for its beauty alone, not moral or political messages. For example, appreciating a painting just for its colours and composition, not its symbolism. The word aesthetics comes from the Greek aesthesis, meaning perception or sensation. Plato discussed beauty and art in dialogues, though he was skeptical of art's moral value. Aristotle analysed tragedy, drama, and catharsis, laying the foundation for systematic art criticism. Alexander Baumgarten is credited as the founder of aesthetics as a distinct philosophical discipline. In Aesthetica, written in 1750, he defined aesthetics as the science of sensory knowledge, a way of understanding beauty and artistic experience systematically. He gave the field its name, Aesthetica, so while Plato and Aristotle discussed beauty and art, Baumgarten was the first to formally acknowledge aesthetics as a philosophical concept and name it as such. At its core, aesthetics is the branch of philosophy that studies beauty, art, taste, and the nature of aesthetic experience. It addresses questions like, what makes something beautiful or sublime? Why is art valuable? For moral education, emotional expression, or its own sake? Can judgments about beauty be objective, or are they purely subjective? Does art matter for what it represents, or for how it is presented? When aestheticism is used, it refers to the art for art's sake movement, which holds that art's value lies in its beauty and not in its moral or political message. Imagine you're looking at a painting in a museum. As an aesthete, you would focus on the harmony of colours, the emotional impact, and the beauty of the work, not whether it teaches a moral lesson or serves a practical purpose. A 19th century aesthete might defend producing beautiful poetry even if it has no political message or social function, arguing that beauty itself is a sufficient justification. Mimesis is the idea that art is an imitation of life or reality. For example, a realistic novel that reflects everyday human struggles. The term mimesis is ancient Greek and literally means imitation or representation. Plato was the first philosopher to discuss mimesis systematically. In works, he argued that art is a form of imitation, specifically a copy of the physical world, which is itself a copy of the ideal forms. Because of this twice-removed nature, Plato was suspicious of art, claiming it can mislead people away from truth. Aristotle developed a more positive view in his book Poetics. He argued that mimesis is natural and valuable. Humans learn through imitation, and art provides insight, catharsis, and understanding. So Plato was the first to philosophically acknowledge mimesis, though Aristotle gave it a richer and more constructive interpretation. Mimesis, as a philosophical concept, is the idea that art, literature, and drama represent or imitate reality, human action, or nature. Art reflects or imitates the real world, including objects, actions, and emotions. Humans naturally imitate, and mimesis can teach moral lessons, evoke emotions, or create shared understanding. The way imitation is performed, such as in a painting, in poetry, or at the theatre, shapes how we understand reality. Imagine a play about a tragic hero. The mimetic view is that the play is an imitation of real human struggles, giving the audience insight into courage, fate, and suffering. Another example, with visual art, a realist painting that depicts a landscape accurately would be considered a mimetic work because it imitates the natural world. Even in modern times, movies, novels, and TV shows are often seen as mimetic. They portray life, relationships, and conflicts in a way that reflects reality. The sublime is an aesthetic concept describing experiences of overwhelming grandeur, beauty, or terror. For example, standing at the edge of the Grand Canyon. The idea of the sublime, that certain experiences evoke awe, vastness, or even terror, goes back to ancient philosophy. Longinus, from the 1st century, is credited with first discussing the sublime systematically in his treatise. He argued that the sublime in literature and rhetoric elevates the soul, transports the listener beyond rational thought, and creates a feeling of greatness. Edmund Burke connected the sublime with feelings of terror, vastness, obscurity, and power, contrasting it with the merely beautiful. Immanuel Kant, in Critique of Judgment, refined the concept, arguing that the sublime arises when the mind confronts something beyond comprehension, such as infinity, or overwhelming power, and recognizes its own rational ability to think the infinite. So Longinus was the first philosopher to formally acknowledge the sublime, though it became a major topic in 18th century aesthetics thanks to Burke and Kant. The sublime is the idea that some experiences evoke awe, fear, or a sense of overwhelming vastness that goes beyond beauty and elevates the mind. It goes beyond pleasure, it overwhelms, even frightens. It's often associated with mountains, storms, oceans, the night sky, things that seem limitless or beyond human control, and it lifts the observer's mind to a higher state of awareness. Imagine standing on the edge of a cliff or overlooking a vast canyon during a thunderstorm. You feel tiny, even fearful, yet you also feel a strange exhilaration and awe at the sheer scale and power of nature. This mixture of fear, admiration, and transcendence is what philosophers would call the experience of the sublime. Another example could be reading a passage from Milton's Paradise Lost that describes the cosmic battle between heaven and hell, which might produce feelings of grandeur and terror, a literary experience of the sublime. So that's all I'm going to go through on this episode. If you haven't noticed, names like Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, Immanuel Kant, John Stuart Mill, Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and René Descartes have a massive part to play in the formalization of the philosophy we know and understand today. This has affected how our governments are run, how our laws are made, and how our cultures are celebrated, particularly in the West. I've purposely elided quite a few of the famous works their thinking has come from to save time on this episode, but reading their works in the context of the time they were written is fundamental for understanding these philosophies more profoundly. Feel free to look into these philosophers, as I always try to leave a transcript with every episode I post, so you can find their names there, and their most famous work is usually easy to find. If you weren't familiar with philosophy before you started listening to this episode, you might be surprised how much philosophy has contributed to Western civilization. If you were familiar with philosophy before you started listening to this episode, then I hope you learned something new, or at least have been given something to think about. Thanks again for listening, and until the next episode.